All right. Well, hello. If you came for the not a DevOps talk, this is it. I just didn't update the slide. Don't worry. And that's also next week's show if you want to talk about seniors and pets. Anyways, so this is a talk that I have, as Boyd kind of summarized it, that sort of goes over what I see happening and some advice in companies that would be interested in something like DevOps or improving the way that they do IT and trying to figure out what's going on there. And also making sure they orient themselves correctly around what software actually is and how it works. So this comes from a lot of experience I have, mostly talking with large organizations and people there who are looking to, I don't know, do all of that digital transformation stuff. Or as we used to call it back when I was younger, your business IT alignment, if you remember that kind of stuff. Which is to say, we run a business or we do a government sort of thing, and we would like to use computers, namely custom-written software, in a sane way that would help our business, right? Like, as a simple example, I was just renewing my passport earlier today, and it turns out when you renew your passport with the US, where I'm a citizen, I guess you could reverse engineer from there. You can't actually hand fill out the form. You've got to fill it out online, and they won't accept hand filled out form, which is just like, for anyone who's sitting here on a Monday night at a DevOps thing in Rackspace, it probably like seems obvious, but like that's crazy. That that an organization like the State Department would think like they should fill this out online. So you imagine all the other things that where software could be introduced into various business processes, and it's that's the potential that you see around DevOps, or as we would say in Pivotal Land, cloud native, is there really is a chance to get to what I used to call programmable businesses or software-defined businesses, where the way you're operating can move at kind of the whatever speed of sane software that you want. Hopefully, you don't find yourself in a situation like Boyd was describing. But several people here said they were hiring, and Pivotal's always hiring. They lowered the referral bonus this year, so I'm not that motivated, but I still like money. Anyways, so this is me, in case you can't tell. I just took some new shots of myself, but I haven't updated it yet. So that's an old one. I was telling my wife when she was taking this picture that that's actually, I don't think I'd bathed for a couple days, and that's like half a day at SeaWorld in August. So miraculously, I think I look pretty good, given those conditions. But I really need a more professional photo, so maybe next time I'll have that. So as Boyd said, I work at Pivotal, and I work on the part in Pivotal that talks about and works on Pivotal Cloud Foundry. I work on what we call the developer advocate team, but as you'll notice, I don't actually have a terminal open. I'm like the one person on that team who just does slides. I'm kind of like the management consultant developer advocate, I guess. You might call it the beleaguered manager advocate. I'm trying to help out with people who are figuring out how to improve the way they do their software. And over the 20 or so years I've worked in IT, I've been an analyst a couple times, once at 451 Research, another time at RedMonk, if you're familiar with them. Both of them do really great work. It's hard, 451's a little less accessible, but you should definitely check those out. And as I'm sure many people in here, being in Austin, I had my compulsory 2-year service term at Dell for some time. I worked on corporate strategy and M&A there on cloud and software, which is really fun. From if you remember what I fondly call the first cloud war. Right, from about 2010 to 2013 is when I worked there. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on there. And I used to be a software developer when I did real work. I'm really good at slides now, so you can see that. If you need help aligning things automatically, I can tell you where that is. I write a monthly column, except in August and December, because apparently in the UK, nothing happens in August and December. But I write that for the Register, and you can go check that out. That's especially delightful because you can see all of the wonderful ways that people who don't know how to spell virtualization or color can come up to insult me in the comments section. It's a good read. I do several podcasts, about 3 of them. I do one called Software Defined Talk with a couple of friends of mine. That's probably your best bet if you don't leave before I get to the next slide, if you're interested in more. And I do one for Pivotal, and I do kind of a little random one that has some of my old drunken retired stuff, if you're familiar with that. There's always one guy, I don't see him here, who tells me I should be doing that more. But you can check those out. They're definitely fun. And then there's a bunch of other nonsense down there. You can contact me. So I should also say, I just, on my Twitter account, which is Cote, C-O-T-E, posted the slides for these if you're interested in getting them. I like to show off by having lots of citations. and microphones that cut in and out. Gives me a challenge. So like I was mentioning, a lot of what I end up studying is kind of what goes on in this situation, right? And Boyd was joking about this a little bit, the idea that there you are, puttering along in your IT department. You're like, man, I wonder when a new season of that Netflix show I really like, I just watched that Castlevania one. Why'd they only release 4 episodes? They should have released all of it. That was quite the annoying cliffhanger at the end. Also, I never realized I liked anime that much. And how do they get those torches to glow? And then all of a sudden this person busts in and they say, hey, we're doing some digital transformation here. We're going to change how things are operating, and you're going to have to change what your job does and how you operate. And it's more than likely, as we see in this situation, that it's probably not going to work out well, and you should go talk to that Cote guy about a new job, because I'll probably fire you, because it's going to go terribly. And, mysteriously, this person is often someone you've never seen before. They're usually pretty old, and they usually don't have that much hair. And, it's kind of like, and they're telling you to do these terrible things, and you're just sort of like, what? What's going on here? I was having fun fighting Picard in a room, and now I'm having to deal with this stuff. So, a lot of the people that I talk with in my job and as analysts, they're stuck in this situation. And, I think what a lot of what occurs is sort of like, as I was frustrated one day, I think I'd just been in a presentation with some large organization. Maybe it was like a military or government one, and they kept repeating that they wanted to do Agile over and over again. Like even when they were talking about like desktop management. And it seemed like there was kind of this wacky notion of what it would be to do Agile and DevOps, and hence the original thing, like not a DevOps talk, right? It's sort of like, as Boyd was advising, before you go hire these 3 people and order yourself a bunch of firewalls and routers, I don't know what any of that is. I was an application developer. You should really understand what it is you're aiming for. What are these things, and what is Agile and DevOps, and what's the point of it? And I bring this up because when I'm advocating for the beleaguered managers, they often have their organization, let's say, they have a wacky notion of what software is. And I think there's 2 notions, especially in large organizations, I encounter all the time. And the first thing in making sure you're not doing I brought my son, but he's out of the room, so I guess I can curse a little bit. They're doing the dumb shit. And it's good to kind of spot these to use another funny word from the early 2000s, paradigms of software that they do, and make sure that you triangulate and remove them on the right ones. So the first notion I encounter a lot is this idea that this software that you're writing to help run your business or your organization is like a grocery store, right? You're just going to go and you're going to get a bunch of people like me and other vendors come in and tell you why you should go into their grocery store, buy their product, and install it. And it might be sort of like that cake that you just add water to, and then magically everything's going to work out, right? Or even better, it's that gigantic, wonderful pre-made thing where at worst you'll have to heat it up. But in reality, I mean, like we all work in, we've all encountered this stuff. It's not really like you can just buy some off-the-shelf thing and install it, and that's going to help maximize the customizability of your the way your business operates, right? Like, if anything, there are certain grocery store applications that you should be looking into. Like, if you can run anything, as in a SaaS model, right, instead of having to manage it on your own, that's probably a good idea. In fact, if that bald, strange person that's come to tell you about the digital transformation, that's a good place to start for a year, is really just like, what on-premise applications do we have running? And let's not do that. Because anytime you're spending doing that, it's not really spent on the more important things, the custom-written software you would want to have. But sort of be aware that when people, especially high up in the organization, are looking to change how IT is done, make sure they don't have this notion that the custom-written software you're doing, anything you would be doing more or less in a DevOpsy or a cloud-native context, it's not going to have this grocery store mentality to it. So second, even if someone does understand what custom-written software is sort of like, and the way that it's something that you have to build on your own and manage on your own. The second most common misperception that kind of creates all sorts of problems for your DevOps implementations and rollout, and also for your businesses not working out well, is what I always think of as sort of like the one of the main plot points of submarine movies. Now, if you're like me and had your primary sort of like view of the world built up by watching a bunch of 80s movies, you probably watched a lot of submarine movies, right? And inevitably, in any submarine movie, one, there's like, inexplicably, all the Russian submarine commanders have a Scottish accent. But you've got like, there's always this moment in the submarine movie where like something's broken down and either they're going to run out of oxygen or the Americans or the Russians are going to be able to detect them, something terrible because something's broken in the submarine. And so they'll have the engineer who inevitably, you know, is like this very unhealthy person. He's like that doctor in Battlestar Galactica, one of those figures. The new one. I don't know what the old one looked like. I was too young then. But they come into the officer's mess, and depending on if they're Russian or American, they sort of like swipe off the tea or the coffee, and they roll out this big schematic. And, you know, imagine how these things happening in your meetings for your various software things. And the engineer, you know, as he looks over his cigarette with smoke coming up of it, and you're wondering, like, how can he smoke on a submarine? But it was a different time. And he points down and he's like, all we have to do is replace this one bolt. And then and then we can get on our way. And the captain's like, that's great. But then of course it's sort of like, oh, and also they're going to die horribly of radiation when they do that. So a lot of times when something's not working out business-wise and you track it back to your software, there's this notion of like, we just got to replace this one bolt, right? Like we're going to install some appliance in here to accelerate our slow XML, or like we're going to like put some weird stack under here that's going to speed things up, or whatever the case may be. We've got some green screen thing and it's going to auto transform itself to like Flash or something. And so like, this notion is sort of like the quick fix idea, or that like software is this very knowable schematic thing. And again, you know, things tend to not pan out well if you have this general approach to software. So I bring these two things up because, again, like I talk with lots of large organizations, and you can kind of tell their management has this idea of how software operates. And instead, you want to shift them towards the way that I more think software you know, I should say a model that I have about how software works that's based on nothing original in my thinking. Like any good analyst, I just totally reword and rediagram everything as if I had come up with it. But, you know, this is the model that I see large organizations putting in place who are successful with the software that they do. And, you know, to summarize it, you all seem like smart people. I'm sure you studied the scientific method, right? It's kind of like this industrial application of the scientific method. And if you've, you know, troubled yourself by reading through anything that begins with the word lean nowadays, maybe you've got a Safari subscription and you're just like, I'm really bored. I've run out of my Netflix shows. I'm going to go see what they have to offer me. And you read through these lean books. You'll see that this is a notion of a lean startup. Or, you know, if you've read all those lean books, inevitably they talk about, who's the guy, Colonel Boyd and his OODA loop. What is it? Observe, orient, decide, and kill, I think is what the A stands for, or stay alive. But essentially it's the same loop where you have some problem or an unknown thing ahead of you, right? And I'll go through an example that kind of proves this out. And your goal, and Boyd kind of alluded to this a little bit with the, what were you saying? I didn't have the situational awareness to know what the fuck I should have been doing, to summarize it, which I think is a good point. You have this problem in front of you. So you come up with a theory or a hypothesis of how to solve it. And then you want to figure out a way to figure out if that works or not. So somehow you experiment it. And in software development, and the way we do that is we write code, right? Like, I guess you could kind of test out theoretic whiteboard stuff, but that doesn't really make sense. You got to have code, and then more importantly, you need to have it in front of end users. And then this is the part that I find for many decades we've skipped as IT people is, did it actually solve the problem, right? Like, did it work? Did we, instead of delivering on the MRD and all of our various cabs and specs, which is a fine accomplishment, did it actually solve the problem the user had? Or, you know, whatever your user may be. And if it did, then great. You can go on to the next problem. And if not, then you redo this loop again and figure out how to solve that issue. Now, you know, it's easy to get caught up in DevOps world about like the release speed and cycle time and all that. But that's the thing that makes nowadays this much more valuable and useful, is that if you can do this cycle in a week or even a day, and you can scope down the sort of code that you're shipping to test this stuff out, what that means is you can very quickly end up with software that's actually useful, which, you know, that's always nice to have software that's useful. If you imagine going through this loop on a 6, 9, 12, 18-month cycle, like, it's a little not relevant, right? Like, I mean, you still, eventually you get software in place, but by that time it'll be like, we've finally figured out how to allow people to return DVDs in the mail, and it's 2017 and no one cares, right? Like, you want to have a more rapid cycle of how to solve these issues that you're going there. So I generally call this notion, and many other people use this, but, you know, choosing all the things out of the bucket of fish, I always think of this as the small batch process, right? Going through this loop, coming up with the problem that you're doing and testing it and figuring out if it's worked out or not. So as an example of that, this is a good example, being a government thing, it's not only from a couple years ago, but just recently as well, because it takes quite some time despite the small batch nature of it. This is something that there's another part of Pivotal called Labs that does a lot of consulting, right? You can hire them up and they tell you how to do all of this crazy agile XP sort of stuff and from product management on down. So they were working with the IRS. I'm sure y'all are all familiar with them. And there's this thing at the IRS, like if you don't pay your taxes on time, the reminder system they use, I don't know if you use your OmniFocus or Reminders or Alexa stuff, but they have a good reminder system where every day they charge you more interest and penalties on the money that you owe. So, you're highly motivated, if you like money, to figure out that day how much money you owe and pay it off immediately, right? And so for quite some time, the IRS was using a call center to do this, right? You would have to call someone up, and I'm sure there was like a green screen somewhere involved that they would type things into. And then they could tell you on the call center how much money was owed. Now, there are a couple of problems with this. One is like, while we send money to the IRS, it's not like we like to give them sufficient budget to do their job well. So their budgets are always decreasing, and call centers are expensive, right? Because humans aren't cheap. So you got to, pay these humans. I'm sure you get that cool Cisco hold music and everything going. They're probably just a one-time flat fee, but the humans you have to staff that are not very affordable. And as a result, there was an outside group that studied and said, I think it was about 30% of the time when you called the IRS, they had their own stories in the backlog, which is like, no one likes talking to the IRS. So user would like to not have to talk to the IRS. So about 30% of the time they would do what was called a courtesy disconnect, which is to say they would hang up on you before you were talking with anyone. Now, that is nice. You can get on with your day, not have to worry about it. But, being less jokingly, so you got two problems. One, they need to bring down costs, and two, like the system is not working, right? Like I think what would you call that? A SLA of 70%. Am I doing that math right? That probably doesn't work out so well. So long story short, someone had the good idea to put some software in place, right? Because software works effectively for looking something up on a mainframe and then presenting that number to you. But being accountants, they were using a small batch process for this, working with the labs people. So imagine if they were doing this, as I go over it, imagine if they were doing it on like a 6 or 9 month cycle or longer. So being accountants, they were like, I would like to show you your entire relationship with the IRS, right? Like, you just like the moments thing in your photos application or that little Facebook thing shows you what's been going on there. So they displayed all this stuff. And luckily, because they were following a small batch process, they got it in front of users very quickly. And they discovered that when people were confronted with this over here, now we've highlighted the orange so that you can cheat and figure out what it is, but they discovered that people still wanted to pick up the phone and call someone, which, if you think about it, destroys the entire case of what they were doing, right? Once someone wanted to pick up the phone, they might as well have just not come in that day. It didn't really solve their problem. So, but they did discover this very quickly, and they went through several more iterations, testing out a theory of how they should do it, putting it in front of end users. And it sounds ridiculous when you say it out loud, but think about how many times this has been the case retrospectively when you've done something. It turns out, when you want to know how much money you owe the IRS, all you want to know is how much money you owe the IRS, right? Like, you just want to log in and see that one number. So they finally got to that, and everything was hunky-dory. I don't know what the rates of people wanting to call up were. I mean, I'm sure people still had their little jitterbug phone and wanted to call every now and then just to talk with someone. But the majority of people were happy with this, and they were able to pay off what they were doing. So that's a very simple example of applying a small batch process and the kind of the things that people avoid and the way it can make your software better. But it's intentionally small. And think about if you could apply that same method to have software that actually works on a weekly basis and building up, over a couple of quarters to actual big full-featured things that were valuable. That is the way that I've observed over the years that software works, right? You're constantly honing it and changing it. You're constantly discovering what the problem is and the best way to solve it. And so you want to have that process in place and all the technology that supports it to have that there, right? Like, if you've got this grocery store mentality, right? Like, I mean, if you buy like a gallon of milk, you got to drink through that gallon of milk. What if you didn't want milk the next day? Like you got to, that's a terrible way of putting it. But, you don't want to lock yourself into a process that means you can't update your software, let alone discover new things to do with it. And definitely, if all you're doing is going in and changing that bolt, right, like optimizing one little piece of the software, you're also not going to give yourself the room to actually have ever-improving software and something that's going to be valuable to the business side, as we would say. So, this is a blatant sort of like pivotal marketing pitch. But, the point here being that like, a lot of people like look at this idea of like, we could deploy every week, or we could deploy daily, or we would have a mobile app that wasn't terrible, and so forth and so on. And I encounter a lot of organizations who have this sentiment, right? Like they follow the what I like to call the stop hitting yourself anti-pattern, which is they're very quick to tell you every single reason they can't improve or do anything. But there's plenty of regular companies, right? Not just crazy Spotifys and SoundClouds and people selling you like knitting out of New York and everything, who are getting real like huge results out of following a DevOpsy and cloud native way of doing things. And if you want to hustle pivotal yourself, you can go look up these references. But a lot of these are interesting because they're talks that people at these organizations gave, if you look down there, where they go over things that worked and didn't work. And as you might be able to know, and if you've ever encountered me talking before, all I basically do is go steal content from other people and put it in my slides. So these are like some of the primary sources for actual improvements of what people have done. So it is possible for a regular mainstream company that doesn't, have a fully stocked fridge of 5 types of kombucha, or however you say that, and have you free lunch and all sorts of stuff like that. All sorts of results can be had that gets you closer to that right way of doing software. Now that said, oftentimes, this is what you encounter, right? Like, you go into a large organization and you sort of just shuffle on in there and you're like, yeah, here's, you kind of go in there like a hawker, you bring in a box full of the Phoenix Project and you start throwing it out at people and then you just sort of depart, right? Like that model doesn't really work, but people certainly do seem to try it, right? So the rest of the presentation I want to go over, the rest of the content, what I spend a lot of my time doing is basically like, how do you avoid this tire situation? I don't know if there's really an answer. There's a little bit of an answer for how to extinguish it, but how do you get out of the situation where you're at an organization, you want to get these results and apply DevOps and things like that? What are ways I've seen of people getting over that and the patterns and anti-patterns that they go through?
Remember I said I like irony?
Sure.
This was done by one of those awesome engineers I hired.
Oh, yes.
While he worked for me.
Yeah, it actually has like some GitHub repo behind it, which I've stared at a few times and I don't really understand why. But it's a good image. It's nice and pretty to look at. We could just stare at this for the rest of the evening and think about our fate. That's right, exactly. Well, thanks for that image. I've been using it recently. So the first thing I want to look at, so this is divided into 2 sections, and then I'll hustle up more reading at the end that I've done. So the first thing is like just kind of a quick overview of benchmarking the skills you have, and then there's some more what I would call meatware issues. I mean, this is all meatware stuff. And then we'll look at a little bit of technology stuff at the end. As I mentioned, I can align clip art on slides. I don't actually know how to program anymore or do anything, so I don't talk about that much. But the first thing, obviously, if you're going to be doing custom written software, right? And if you care about DevOps, if you're not writing custom written software, then you're some exotic, freaky thing, right? Like I always like to think that the only reason you care about DevOps is because you have some software you're writing and you want to manage and deploy. I mean, to use my favorite whipping boy, back when I was an analyst, I had to cover desktop management, and you can tell I was not happy about that. But I suppose you could use DevOps principles to deploy patches to desktops, but that seems like a waste of life. Anyhow. So the first thing you would want to check in is like, so are we doing our pure software development well, right? Like just even at an individual and team level in our organization, are we doing software the best that we can, right? Like, I mean, this isn't even on here, but like, you should probably be using version control. You might want to look into that if you're not doing it. But this is a good benchmarking to go through because it kind of proves a couple of points. One of them is that most every organization by this time will tell you that they're doing Agile. They often tell you how many Scrum Masters they have certified, which is always a delightful figure. There's probably a, what do you call that? I've got a philosophy degree, so I don't know how numbers work, but there's probably a negative correlation between people who know exactly how many Scrum Masters they have and them being really lame as an IT organization. But anyways, getting back to this. So if you look at this, this gives you a basis, and this should be a treat. If you like charts, this is Gartner's most recent thing. I went and, here's a pro tip. If you ever have a chart like this, you want to sort these bar charts in a way that makes sense instead of just randomly. So I had to go in and do that for them because they had not sorted. It was very hard to read. But if you read through these things, these are core sort of agile practices. Distributed teams, they actually consider a bad one. I don't know why they have it in there. It's just to kind of like screw with you. But all the other ones are like core agile practices that more or less are known to work. And if you read this, the way I would read it is I would add up the blue and the green. See, I put scary colors on the other ones. You add up the blue and the green, and that sort of gives you a wet finger in the wind sense of how much these practices are done in the world. Now, if you're some sort of stats nerd, you notice the N is really low, but it's basically, it's more or less legit. I wouldn't worry so much about that. But you look down here, and what you realize is that things drop off really quickly. Right? Like, so all these people who know how many Scrum Masters they have and doing Agile, chances are you're not really doing it, right? Like, it's fun to kind of think through this. You look at unit testing, like way back in the late 90s, that seemed like the most onerous, terrible thing ever, but it turns out it's actually really easy. Everyone enjoys it. It makes your life better. So of course people do that. And then again, distributed teams is an anti-pattern, so don't pay attention to that. And then there's refactoring. It's like, oh, I know how to right click. Sure, I do that. No problem. And then, you know, it very quickly drops off after that. So the whole point of this is, if you're looking to improve the way you're doing software, especially if you're in a management position or can influence them, it's probably a good idea to make sure you're actually doing things, all these agile practices, because chances are you're not really following them. And that pattern happens over and over again. Like, again, back to the 80s, our fearless leader at the time would say, you know, trust but verify, which is a very artful way of saying don't trust anyone. So you should really go in and verify that you're following these things as much as possible. So, speaking of management, I think especially if you're looking to do the digital transformation, do DevOps, whatever it is you want to do, improve the way you're doing software. How many managers are in the room here? Wow. Just 2. That's great. Usually there's a lot more. Well, this is for everyone else in the room. Here, you know, the first thing that you need to realize is that management is going to be the first one to screw it up, right? Like, bar none, success begins and ends with management, right? Like, I tried to come up with a good metaphor, but all I can think of is sort of like, you know, you ever have one of those Reuben sandwiches? I don't know if if you're vegan or vegetarian, maybe there's tempeh in there, if that's your life choice. But, you know, you got a Reuben, and if you think about it, management's like the bread, right? Like, if you don't have the bread holding it in, all you've got is like a mess of like a bunch of meat and Russian salad dressing. And like, management is sort of like this. They have to be there to contain everything, define what the parameters are of what you're doing. You know, if you know what strategy is, they need to come up with that. Or is that, what's that guy's name? That TEDx guy, the why guy? They have to tell you why you're doing something and do that guidance. Like, it's probably not a good idea for you to do that on your own and everyone to do it. And they're also going to be in charge of who gets paid, what the compensation is, how you shape the organization. Basically, if you think about it, they're, you use another analogy, they're a lot like a dungeon master. I'm sure most everyone here knows what that is, hopefully. If you remember the role-playing games, you know, and the dungeon master would be the person who, you know, to get all these players, all these people who are like all your rogues and your bards, whatever, paladins. And they would be there sitting and waiting for a story and a world to operate in. And the dungeon master is the one who like sets up the game and the context and the controls and everything. And if you didn't have a dungeon master, you just have a bunch of like drunk people making dumb jokes all night, right? Like, you got to have someone who's like running the game and sets up the system to do. And again, that becomes management. And so this is, you know, he's become a good friend of mine since I met him at Pivotal. This is this guy, Matt Curry at Allstate. And he gives several great talks about how they've been changing over from a management perspective at Allstate. And it goes all the way from like dealing with the facilities people about having scooters in the hallway. There's a good little anecdote in one of his recent talks about that. To actually, you know, opening up spaces so that people can collaborate with each other and do pair programming. To justifying how we reformalize team structure so we have a full-on balanced team and all of that. To even little things like this, like, as quoted here, having the, what do you call it, semiotics or whatever, but having the signaling, throwing the shape of, to use some jargony term for it, or reverse of jargon, of like this management person is actually serious about changing the way they're doing things. So, instead of coming to that all hands meeting, well, one, they come to an all hands meeting, which is always nice. And instead of coming there all dressed up and nice, they start to dress like the developers, like, as they used to say in my grandpa's time, they go native, right? And this is very important. This is why I always ask if there's managers around, right? Because as staff people, I've been staff most of my life, individual contributor, I think they say, IC, which that sounds terrible. But anyways, one of the main things that you become an expert at as you get older, if you hold down a job for more than 3 months, is spotting bullshit in management, right? Like, you're very fast to spot if this person is just spewing a bunch of crap, and then you can ignore them, right? So management needs to make people trust in them and believe what they're doing and do all of the sort of game setting stuff. So the point there's a lot more to say about what management does, but as I go through the rest of it, you'll see that if management wasn't there to make it happen, it would be incredibly difficult to scale up to an organization size. All of, whether you think of it as DevOps or just improving the way that you do custom software, they become key to most everything. So speaking of that, this is one of the what often happens, if you think about since we're here at the DevOps meetup, you think about the idea of, so a DevOps team is like this unified team of, as the name would imply, developer and operators, and you probably also have a product person and a designer, whatever roles you need, and they're fully dedicated to the service or the application that they're doing, right? And usually when you put that in front of people, they're just like, "Whoa, time out. That's not how we operate. We do the equivalent of sharding people across teams, and we definitely don't have all these different roles talking with each other. That's crazy talk, right? I don't know how I would go in Workday and figure that out in the job code assignment for first thing, or I don't know, whatever you may be using." So to get around that and all sorts of other cultural things, there's another thing that comes up a lot, which you could call the I don't want to do that. Right? So you encounter a lot of individuals who don't want to do things in a new way, definitely are not interested in changing. They only want to keep doing things in their current way, whether in management and staff. And there's one main thing I've seen people, the easiest path, sort of, that gets the best results, is what they end up doing is, instead of changing the organization from within, from the bottom, what they do is they set up an entirely new organization. They often call it a labs. If you're cursed, they'll call it a center of excellence or something like that. But they'll set up this lab structure, and they slowly move people over to this new organizational structure, which gives them the ability to do all this wacky new stuff, right? People don't come up with excuses of why they can't do something. So I always think of this as a way of unfreezing an organization. And you see people like Allstate and Humana and GE, some people that I talk with every now and then, they follow this practice. It's not always possible. Sometimes you have to do the let's do the old change the engine while the plane is flying trick, which can be difficult. Hopefully you've got more than one engine on it, and then maybe you can pan that out. But that's the first thing to think about from a management perspective, is what if we set up, as they used to call it, a skunk works, and then the skunk works starts to become mainstream. Now this has another good effect. If you think of all those the unwilling people who don't want to change, you might call them I always get it mixed up, but I think they're mode 1 people. They got a mode 1 mind, right? They want to operate in an old way. You have to voluntarily, to some extent, move over to the new organization, so you just leave them behind, right? They got all their old fun legacy stuff to manage, and you don't have to worry about them becoming like a turd in your punch bowl, essentially. Which, it's not always possible to avoid that, but at least you've got a structure set up so you can avoid people forcing them to change, which often doesn't really work out well. So the next, and again, you can see the reason I start with management, because a lot of this is driven by, at large organizations, enterprise architect types and managers and people who can make decisions like this. And the next thing that I commonly see, and Home Depot is the best sort of study of this, and Comcast has done this as well, and all sorts of other people who don't like to name themselves, is the idea of what, over the next year and then 2 years, what's going to be our ramp up for doing this, right? And this is yet another thing that kind of Boyd hit on indirectly, is to put it in my way, right? When you're first starting out to changing how you're doing IT, doing DevOps or cloud native stuff, if someone wants to rewrite your .com site as the first project, you should probably talk to me about a new job, right? Like that's going to be terrible and it's just going to blow up in your face and not work really well, right? Like whatever your core stacks are, your core applications are, you don't really want to like screw with those and use them to learn how to do things in a new way. Not only as an individual, but as an organization, right? So instead what you want to do is you want to find a series of small projects that sort of fit this criteria of they're not science projects. You don't use them just to have people more easily sign up for a Wi-Fi password when they come visit you. I mean, I guess those are important for everyone in this room. But you want a project that's actually like real and business facing, but also is, I don't know how to rate this, but low risk and low complexity, right? And so you do a series of these projects as you learn organizationally and you learn the technology. And just never mind the exact figures here, but this is Home Depot doing this. You can see they start off sort of slow here and then they slowly ramp up, and at some point they get this confidence that they're going to do more and more applications. So as an example, at Home Depot, like a couple of the first applications they picked, you know, I'm sure like me, you want to paint stuff every now and then. You go to the custom paint desk, and I didn't realize this till I talked to them, but they have some custom written software that runs that desk. So that's something that they picked to work on, right? Like it's an actual real product. And also it wasn't working very well for them. So if they screwed up, it wasn't a big deal because it was already not satisfactory. So that was an interesting project that they started working with. Then they picked another one. The Pro Tool rentals business also runs on custom software. And so they find more and more of these things until they can eventually scale up to like the huge multi-million, if not billion-dollar moneymaker applications. And they build up that internal trust with themselves and with the rest of the organization and the training and knowledge and skills that they need to actually change things over that way. So I forgot that I had this slide here. This is just an example of other people. I would have gone to this instead of babbling on so much. But this is another example of the number of applications in the first year or so that various companies have done. And you know, it's biased because I work at Pivotal, so these are all Pivotal people. But I think what's interesting to look at here, and it's kind of a wide range, but what I like to tell people is, it's going to be a lot slower than you think. Right? Like you're not going to change all of your portfolio over. In fact, it's probably going to be 3 or 5 years before you have like a huge amount of your applications. And you see that reflected here, right? Like, you know, there are some rapid things that come in, but you're not going to do a tremendous amount of applications across your portfolio every year. You're going to ramp up to it slowly. So you should figure out how to pace yourself and more importantly, manage the expectations that you have so that people don't think if we only do like, you know, 5 to 20 applications, it's been an abject failure. Like, in fact, it might have been great to pace yourself and learn how to do things so that the next year you can ramp up reliably. So one of the reasons you do that, and this is something that I see across lots of companies. I was at a Verizon event a while ago where they were doing this. They had an internal, all of the DevOps days, people get very persnickety if you use the word DevOps day, so they called it a DevOps event. But they have these internal events where they bring everyone across the company in or regionally, and they have speakers come in and talk about their success in doing things in a new way and applying DevOps, and they kind of give out tips for it. So this is one part of what I think of as internal marketing, right? So again, as you can kind of figure out from a lot of what I talk about here and what's in these slides, a huge issue you have, and I guess DevOps people call this culture, is just like sheer resistance to change and people not wanting to change what they're doing and not believing it, right? And I find that a lot of that in an organization is based on not trusting the new thing, right? Not trusting the stack of software, trusting the process. I mean, I guess there is sheer laziness. There's always that, which I'm not opposed to that. And then there's also just the sort of like, there's not enough communication about what the new stuff is and helping people out, right? Like you look at annual surveys about like training and no one really ever trains at all, right? So they don't really like think about their people as assets or you know, parts of the machine that need to be tuned and fixed up and everything. So anyways, as you're ramping up your projects, again, another thing that management has to start taking very seriously is to do a tremendous amount of internal marketing or, you know, boasting, if you will. And that can be anything from whatever, you know, the Chizo monthly newsletter with the early 2000s animated GIFs in it and everything, or, you know, conferences like the Verizon one I was talking about, or actual sort of workshops that you might have. But you have to start thinking about how would we tell the rest of the organization the successes that we've had and build up trust in this new way of doing things. Now, This also gets to the sort of caustic corporate cultures you often encounter, where if there is not this sort of rolling success out there and this proof that something works, then your peers in the management chain, I mean, they, high up in companies, they usually have a very zero-sum approach to that pot of money they get annually and promotions and things like that. So unlike what my junior high school English teacher used to say, she also always used to say, blowing out my candle won't make yours glow brighter. But it turns out in the corporate world it actually does. So you do have to build up this ability to say that our stuff works, build trust with it, and build alliances across the organization. And a good internal marketing or propaganda, if you want to think of it that way, campaign lets you do that and builds up this trust and the kind of alliances you need to further scale out something like DevOps or a way of improving the way that you're doing your custom-written software. So just to use a couple of other examples so we can wrap up here. This is one specific thing that is sort of peculiar in the classic sense of the word, not the judgy way, pivotal. But in working with the large organizations that we do, I've noticed them being resistant to this idea of pairing, and then they start doing it and they get really interesting results from it. So you're probably familiar with pair programming. You probably had that filed in the ideas that are terrible column, if you're like most people, if you remember that survey. And pair programming comes out of, I don't know, like, where's that from? Like, it was written up in XP in maybe like 99 or so. So it's been around for a long time. Now, there's a lot of academic studies about pair programming. I think a lot of them suffer from equaling whatever graduate students I happen to have that semester, which doesn't seem like a really great way to study anything, but I don't know, grad students are fine, I guess. But you look at sort of more anecdotal studies, and there actually is, especially recently, a huge amount of improvement that people get from not only pair programming, but pairing on things like operations and design and even product management. And, there's the sort of intuitive maxim that two heads are better than one, as illustrated here, although there's a third head, but I've never really heard. Maybe it's a Cerebus situation. But anyways, what you tend to see, there's a lot of interesting side effects aside from just the having two people look at code. So one of it starts from the idea that you're syncing up knowledge, and to some extent, you're doing design reviews. I don't know how to pronounce Latin, but what would you call that? In situo or something? You're doing them on the job, on their own, right? So you need a lot less time to do code reviewing because you've always got people there. There's another interesting effect, and that is if you rotate these pairs, so you don't always work with the same pair, as lovely as that might be. Like maybe these two will end up getting married. They've been pairing forever, and they'll have a lovely relationship. And then there's that guy. What's he doing here? But anyways, you want to rotate these pairs around, if only to make sure you're HR compliant as far as people having relationships. But what happens there is you're diffusing the knowledge out, right? Like, and if you're familiar with the sort of like morbid sort of stuff we have in the IT world, we have this idea of a bus number, right? And now I always forget the bus number stuff, but it's basically like you want to is it minimize or maximize? You want to make sure that it would take a bus killing a lot of people before you were in trouble, right? If a bus can only kill one person and your project's tanked, your bus number's bad. So if you think about the way you're diffusing knowledge and you're rotating people you're working with, they're working on different parts of the system, everyone begins to have a sense of the entire system, right? Like they know what's going on everywhere, and you don't have those specialized silos of knowledge. And this is, I remember we had a build person, and that guy was a silo for sure. It was always like a bottleneck on the build to do anything. So anyways, you remove these sort of bottlenecks. Now this has another interesting effect, which is if you think about scaling up something like DevOps, eventually you're going to want to go outside of your team. You're going to want to go to other teams and scale it to tens, if not hundreds of different teams. And what you do there is you take some of these pairs and you move them to that other team, and then they pair with people, and then they pair with people, and I'm sure you're familiar with the Amway pitch, right? It's like a positive pyramid of diffusing this knowledge out, and that does, I see that in effect in organizations a lot, and that also has this effect of building up trust for things. So again, it's a way of moving this knowledge and trust of how to operate in a new way outward. Now, there's another good effect which leads to this next point, right? So if you think about when you're pair programming or pairing on anything, it's a little hard to do what in my day we used to call research, where you're just like, I've got to go research something. And then, at the end of the day, you've gotten really up to date on what's happening in Futurama, and you've perfected your Simpsons quotes and not written a line of code. You've done some really good research there on the internet. Or goofing off. as I think people would call it. So if you're pairing with someone, it takes two bad eggs to goof off all day long, right? Like you've got this pressure, I guess, literal peer pressure to actually be doing work and to be doing something. And just sheerly by pairing, as we see in several examples with our customers, people increase their productivity a huge amount, right? Like they go from working like a few hours actually doing code a day to working like 6 or 7 hours a day, which if you think about it is amazing, right? Now, there's a other side of this, and again, this is an interesting example where management becomes important, right? I mean, I guess you could have sort of like a revolution from the below sort of thing, but that's not really how corporate organizations work. But you take the same approach to all these meetings that you usually have, right? And just as an example, right? Like, I mean, the goal is to eliminate going to meetings, but if you think about it and you think about optimizing each worker, workers in IT spend a lot of time in meetings, right? Like, so they come in like your stereotypical like Iron Man and flip-flops sort of, Iron Man t-shirt and flip-flops person. They come in at like 9:30 or 10, right? Because no one goes to bed on time. Or you wanted to go to the gym and you stayed late. I don't know anyone who does that, but you come in at 9:30 or 10 and you got to get a cup of coffee. So you go over to the coffee machine, you get a refill of coffee. There's probably someone there. You talk about whatever happened, maybe whether it's on Hacker News or whatever show you watched, all sorts of craziness going on. You talk about bathroom bills or whatever. And the next thing you know, it's like 10 o'clock. You're going to need another cup of coffee, right? So you got to get that before you go back to your desk. Then it's time to check email. You might do a little bit of research. And then you got to go to that architectural review meeting where you learned how the new pagination framework works. And, that's going to last from about 10:30 to 11:30. And by that time, it's time for lunch. And no one can ever decide where to go to lunch, right? Have you ever had this problem? You get a group of like N+1 people and no one will just decide. So you spend like 20 minutes doing that. You might even write a small script to help you decide. And then you go to lunch and then, you got to drive to lunch. That takes a long time. Then you got to sit down at lunch and then you come back from lunch after you drove from lunch. And let's say it's about like, at best, like 12:30 or 1. And if you're like me, you've gone to some sort of like Mediterranean or Indian buffet, you're going to need some coffee, right? So you go back and you get some coffee and, that's going to be delightful. And then you kind of have a waking nap for a while. And then by that time, I don't know, let's say it's 2:30 or 3, it's time to open up your IDE, update all your code, start doing some work. You got to open up that bug report to see, where you were. And I don't know if you've driven around here, there's a lot of traffic. So it's like 4:30 and you're like, I'm out of here, right? Like I got to beat rush hour. So you basically do a couple hours of work a day, right? Like you've eaten really well and you've helped the coffee industry. So the whole point is, as an individual and as your team, you've got to think about like, should I be going to all these meetings? Like, shouldn't I be working? And as another simple management trick, right? Like, and I'm using Allstate again, but there was this phenomena where developers would go out and hire other developers and their recruits would say like, yeah, I'm sure you do Agile there, Allstate. That's ridiculous, right? Like you just go eat buffets all the time and all that. But the developers who would work there would be like, no, get this. One day I came into work and my manager had put an all day long meeting every day on my calendar called Don't Go to Meetings. And I mean, it's this representation of management made sure that people actually didn't have all these meetings they were beset with. And if you go back to the pairing and things like that, this diffusing out knowledge, having your sort of inline design reviews, a lot of the processes that you follow get all of the same results of going to all these meetings, but they end up doing it in a much more efficient way. And this phenomena, right, like to put it simply, of actually focusing on doing work is a huge amount of the optimization that you see organizations going through when they shift over to a DevOps-y cloud native way of doing things. So finally, let me just actually, I'll just wrap up. Lucky for you, I'll skip the crass pivotal commercialization stuff at the end. I'll tell you the short version of it, though. I like to say I'm not going to do things and then do them. But just to give you the brief pitch there, right? Like a lot of enabling moving faster and doing things, right? Like we get obsessed in the DevOps world with tools, and we go in and out of this idea if that's a good idea or not. But I find that it actually is important to have good tools in place, right? Because a huge amount of what we do in DevOps and in the cloud native world is automating a tremendous amount of things. And the way we end up automating it is by the polite way of saying it is standardizing how we do things. The impolite way is to say restricting people and putting, restrictions on stacks that can be used. So essentially, you end up, when you want to move at deploying every day or every week, you're going to need to automate a tremendous amount of setup that you have, right? Like you don't want tickets to get lost in the queue. And doing that means that you're going to put some sort of platform in place, right? Like this is sort of like based on an aggregate study of platforms that people have built in the retail and financial sector. You can go read the full white paper if you want. And you got all this stuff. And people love building all this stuff on their own. But then, you got a whole product here you have to maintain. And depending on how broad it is and how many people are doing it, you can, of course, we wrote this white paper, so we're very biased. But just doing a quick back of the envelope or cocktail napkin calculation, and based on the experience of people we interviewed, you got about like a 2-year sort of time on building all this stuff. And if I remember the staffing, it's something like 40 or 50 people that you have to hire to do it, and that's going to run you like $7 or $10 million annually, right? So congratulations. Now you can start working on what you actually wanted to do in the first place once you've built that product. So there's all sorts of things out there. Obviously, at Pivotal, we have opinions about what you should use, right? Like this whole unified stack of things that layers on top of your infrastructure. But, to keep about 20% of my promise, I won't detail that too much. I'll just point you towards it. And with that, so a lot of this content is based on a book that I wrote late last year, booklet, I should say. It's only like 49 pages. But I covered and kind of pointed at several of the things there, like the importance of management and the small batch approach and things like that. But there's a lot of other topics, like I slipped, so to speak. I skipped over governance and compliance and outsourcing and things like that. But if you're really interested, you can get a copy of this for free. I don't know if you know about the plus sign in Gmail, but if you want to have us not send you email, just put your little plus sign in lead gen and then delete all those emails, and we won't bug you. But you got to give some sort of email address over there. And you can read some more details of what's going on there. And like I was saying earlier, this is the kind of stuff that I spend most of my time going over. So I'm always happy to talk about it. If you want to get lunch or something, I've got a corporate Amex. We can go get a moderately priced lunch and expense it and talk about how wonderful computers are. That's what I always enjoy. So with that, thanks for letting me go on. I always go a little bit long, I think, which is fun for me. I always like to end my talk with this quote because it's, I think, what I've ended up focusing on, right? Like trying to study and improve how we're doing software, what my team at Pivotal does and Pivotal as a whole does. And really, it's this last part that I think I've noticed that most organizations don't do this. Vendors certainly do it because they would like to help you find your checkbook and sign a check to them. They're very helpful in that respect. But when it comes to other organizations that are actually working on this stuff, they're not very chatty, right? They don't really help each other. They think the idea of how we would configure a server is some sort of proprietary information that is going to totally tank their business if they were to talk about it. But I would encourage you, as you sort these things out and you come through things that work and don't work, it's always helpful to go talk with people. Because for as much as I waited till here to bring up the whole computers eating the world and all that nonsense. But as much as that is a bunch of nonsense, and there's a lot of it that's true. And if we can improve the way that we do software, even a few percentage points each year, everyone's life will be more delightful. So you should go do that. And as always, I can stick around for some questions here and there, but I'm pretty easy to get a hold of. And thanks again.
Questions for Michael? No, really? He answered all your questions. 5 seconds. Okay. 1, 2, 3. I would like That's So please wait for the mic so that we can get your question. This is all being recorded and it'll be on YouTube.
So how does one transition from a developer to middle management, strategy, salesman kind of stuff you're doing now?
Yeah, this is an uncomfortably common question, but well, I'll give you a short answer and a long answer. The long answer is if to self-promote more, which is a tip that you should get on. If you look several episodes back in Software Defined Talk, there's 2 episodes where we talk about just that. But the more genuine, concise answer is I mean, there's two things. One, you have to be willing to and be able to communicate in all forms of medium, right? So, I don't know. I can communicate, right? I mean, I don't know if tonight's performance proves that or not, but in various mediums, I can communicate effectively and explain things. So you need that skill. And then the second thing is, it's like the old Hollywood thing. You just got to get a break somehow. And the way you architect that is by being out there and most importantly, publishing, right? Like you've got to have stuff out there that people can come across and evaluate you by, because, a job like mine, you don't really interview for, right? Like people know you and they hire you and they know what your capacity is for it. So you have to already prove that you know what you're doing. And so if you're not putting out a bunch of content already, like that's the next thing to spend a fair amount of time doing. Just to, I used to think of it as an outboard brain, right? Like you got to show that you know what you're talking about. And then, there's the usual classic hustling of just like know people and ask them to do things for you. That works well too. So hopefully that's somewhat answering.
So to piggyback on that, that content that Michael's talking about creating, that gives you something to point people to via Twitter, or when they ask you what you know or what you do, you can say, oh, here's my card and go read my blog, right? The other thing that you can do is you could ask somebody like me who runs a meetup, hey man, can I talk about X? Because several people have done that. So you want to be the opening act in a couple of months? Let me know. I got a spot for you. Just tell me what you want to say and we'll work it out. That's not just for Silver. That's for anyone else who's thinking the question too. That's what makes this community. It's really that simple.
And also to add a very tactical thing, this can be a disaster or help you on that path or mean nothing, to be all Tony Roma about it or not. What's the guy in Glengarry, Glen Ross? I don't know football, so I always confuse him with whatever his name is. Anyways, being a sales engineer is probably helpful, right? Because if you think about what a sales engineer do, we're all fancy. We call them platform architects. But a sales engineer is basically the nerd that goes out with the sales rep, right? And what that means, so you have to be willing to travel a lot. So hopefully, either whoever your spouse or your special lady or male or non-binary person is willing to put up with you traveling, because you're going to have to travel a lot. And so anyhow, a sales engineer basically goes out and talks to lots of organizations, sees things that work and don't work, and also kind of gets a sense of how to hustle, right? Like what works for salespeople and what doesn't work. And working out in the field is a really excellent way to build up credibility and knowledge and meet a lot of people. And then if you start publishing on the back of that, you have a lot of really unique, hard to find content. And I've seen a lot of people, in that role who either have graduated to just like running their mouth late into the night about computers or have the high potential to and could easily do that.
Other questions?
So I'm curious, going to on-site to different companies, you talk about Allstate and Home Depot and these various companies, if you see anything in terms of the way the office is physically laid out that has an impact on the work they're doing, the slide that you had for the pairing, right? It was two people at the same desk surrounded by presumably two people at all the other same desk, which feels like working all day. Pairing in that environment would just be noise and chaos and difficult to concentrate.
Yeah. So there's I think two answers to your part A and B there. Well, so first of all, just because I can't resist, I'll tell you a funny anecdote. I went to go meet with what were they? One of those big insurance companies you've never heard about, and then you go look at the Wikipedia page and you're like, holy crap, this place is huge. They would sell like ransom insurance, that's a delightful thought. Anyways, they had their facilities person come, and the dude had a tape measure. It was awesome. He's like the only person who's ever brought a tape measure to a meeting. And he was there exactly to that point. He was visiting one of our pivotal labs locations, and he wanted to measure out exactly what things look like and what the spacing was, which kind of, while humorous, also tells you the type of mindset you need to have to deal with the crap of being a facilities person. Anyways, so yes, when you look at these sorts of situations, it is the proverbial big open loud room, right? Like, and there often are, the way that Pivotal is very opinionated about this, and we try to push this on our customers. So the orthodox way is to have like these long tables, like out of that Harry Potter dining room, right? And then you'll have like, monitors with those stations, just like you were seeing, exactly like you were thinking, right? Throughout it. And, I've gone into labs rooms a lot, and they're not really as loud as you might think. I mean, inevitably, they've got like polished concrete, and they don't have baffling up in the ceiling or whatever that is. So they suffer from that, but they're actually a lot quieter than you would anticipate a bunch of people talking. And I think that's because probably, most of the pairs are like, and then let's do $_ over here. And like, they're probably whispering with each other. And then also if they're remotely pairing, they usually have a headset and they're talking at a low voice as well. Now, I think there's another part, whether you ask this or not, to be all Sunday morning on you. Like, another thing that comes up all the time is, well, that sounds exhausting. Right? Like, I need time to go research and do things. And indeed, I don't know exactly how long people will sit and pair with each other, but there's intentional breaks. Very few people smoke or I guess vape anymore, so they don't go do their vaping as a break. But like, there are breaks, including lunch and other things where people stop off and get out of the room from pairing, just because otherwise their mind would be putting at the end of the day. But yeah, I mean, I'm kind of giving you a that's not a problem answer to your question. But generally what I see is it is a big open area, and people just aren't that loud.
I'm wondering about your experience with organizations that might be somewhat smaller, especially if they're making transitions and realizing that they don't have any of the knowledge for AWS or certain specific things, and how do you handle the decisions that come into play when they realize that with this new thing they're moving to, no one they currently have on staff is really qualified to design or keep it running?
Right, like the talk before mine. So most of my experiences with large organizations, but thinking smalling that down, that was a big disclaimer, which is to say I'm going to give you a crappy answer, but I'll go on anyways. I think what's implied, for example, in what Boyd was saying, and what's implied in the pacing out the number of apps that you're doing and not writing your .com site is, well, you got to figure that out. Right? Like, there really is no magic trick or sort of like thing you're going to clone that will fix that for you. And that also points back to what I see in organizations of all sizes is it's why management is incredibly important, right? And why it's good as a individual contributor to really check out if management has things handled and if they're going to work out well for you. Because what I do see in the organizations we work with at a team or product level is, they're slow, right? Like, they take their time to learn how to do things, to learn new technologies. They chunk out the code that they're deploying at any given time to something that's small. So the blast radius is very small. And usually the type of organizations I talk with, all the way up to the CIO, if not the board level, they basically have the authorization to, I didn't tell one of my favorite jokes. I was going to allude to my son over there, right? Like, but they have the license to fail constantly, right? It's sort of like, if you think about my son, who's 7-year-old, when he goes to school, all he does is fail all day long, right? Like, he's trying to figure out how math and reading works. It's just fail, fail, fail. Every now and then, he succeeds, and that's great. But it's that same mentality of learning has to be something that you have high level support from. And yeah, I mean, the situation Boyd went over, I mean, that's the tire fire thing. I mean, that comes up all the time. If you just expect people to, I'll channel my friend and boss, Andrew Clay Schaefer, and, that's not going to go well for you, right? Like, you just got to do what actually works, and otherwise find a new job, right? Like, that's the situation. Not very helpful advice. It's sort of like when your doctor says you should eat more vegetables and exercise, and you're like, no, but come on, doc, what do I really need to do?
So to take that a little farther, as the interim CTO at this place I'm at right now, this client, in not making the mistake that I made at Kasasa, I explained to the CEO, who's really trying to get me to step on the gas when there is nobody who has any systems knowledge. We're there because their entire team left. So we're trying to rebuild all the context around this system. Small system, very knowable, but that's what we're trying to do. I just said, look, let's go over to Ruth's Chris. but here's the deal. I'll buy you whatever you want, but you have to put the whole thing in your mouth and start chewing. And she looked at me like I was nuts. And I said, that's what you're asking us to do. We're telling you we want to figure out what size bites to cut this up into and eat this elephant one bite at a time. So it seems trite, but the truth is finding good metaphors to help the people that are not technical understand what they're actually asking you to do, because these aren't stupid people. They just need some way to get into your world to understand what they're trying to do. So look for that metaphor, look for that thing that they value, and then try and build some context for them around what you're doing.
Yeah, and this is another intentional side effect, which I guess you would just call an effect of doing something like pairing, is you bring people who are knowledgeable in, who know what's going on, and they on the job train the people who aren't knowledgeable, and they have that experience of how things actually work, and they're sort of like co-teachers. I don't know. There's probably some phrase in educational literature about that, but they do better pair training with it. But yep.
So if you remember the pyramid that I had, and I pointed at the bottom of the pyramid where 90% mastery occurs, that's the teaching and the doing. That's the secret sauce of pair programming that you're talking about, is exactly that. It's the same research applied. So that's been done in education circles since the 70s when, oh, hey, let's put kids, you remember you had to work with that asshole who wasn't going to do any of the work and you got the good grade and he got it with you, you know, that sort of thing. That's the base research that all that's coming from. So that actually comes out of the academia you mentioned earlier.
Any other questions?
I have to keep in mind we're recording. I'll choose my words wisely. I just recently left a company that's been around for 150 years, and the CTO announced 18 months ago, we're doing DevOps. Everybody does it. In conjunction, we're going to tie it with a cost-cutting reduction and split everybody 70% offshore. It's coming to fruition in September. Has that ever worked well?
I don't know. No. I mean, to give you a more vociferous answer, I've talked with people. So Garmin's an example that's kind of public, that do offshoring, right? And they have some good tricks that makes it work. I mean, if you think about, I mean, to be very short about it, if you think about the rainbow and sandals scenario of microservices, where we have all these independently operating, non-dependent things driven by teams that magically work together, like that model kind of works if you have like multiple remote working and offshoring, right? It's the same way that like, well, I guess they probably do, but it's not like Apple and Facebook and Google and all these people get together and everything, you know, they work on a weekly scrum or whatever and everything integrates together. It just sort of like they figure it out as independent people. So there are ways of setting up, let's even call it remote, right? Like there, you can have, I remember when I was working at a certain software company, we had people in Austin and Houston, and they might as well have been working on the moon for as far as we could coordinate with them. And so there's ways of doing it. It's just really hard. And especially, yeah, cost cutting is fun. It's like everyone, it's sick of my shit. Anyways, the issue with cost cutting is if you remember back to the slide of like, here's phenomenal results companies that are older than have gotten. From an actuarial point of view, if that's the right language, you could say like, oh, they've got 70% improvement, which means I can fire X% of people. And I mean, I guess that's sort of like, you know, if you roll the first car off the assembly line, you don't go kill all the horses first thing, right? Like you need to transition somehow and make sure that you're not cutting out the costs you have. So, I mean, again, it's another example of what I was talking about here earlier, right? Like it turns out if you exercise more and eat fruits and vegetables, you'll be healthier. And yeah, I mean, the approach that you're describing, to put it into the comic book villain character that it so often is, like it doesn't really work. And it also gets you, it has another effect that I think is more appealing to higher level, C-level and board level people that they could study and believe in, which is if you go look at the history of the past 20 years or so of IT, and I sort of know because I go talk with these people and they complain at me about it. They say like, in the 2000s, we had this awesome CIO who now works somewhere else. And they went and outsourced everything. And now we're here bleeding on the floor to you. Right? Like, so it's sort of like over and over again, people try to outsource this stuff and it just like doesn't work over the long term. And there's probably some like Harvard Business Review article about that, but yeah, it's not a good idea to do that. And so if you're in a situation where like you have to do that, which sort of often happens, I mean, I think the best defense is to start with something small and build up success with that, and then do something else. And then once you get to like 3 or 5 projects, like what I see happening a lot is once you do that internal marketing effectively based on successful projects that you have, and you get it in front of the right people, all of a sudden they're like, oh, well, I had no idea that IT didn't have to suck, right? Like there's actually a good new way of doing things that's proven that works on a business. And then you get into a whole other problem, which is like, oh, we should have everyone do this by next quarter. And I mean, that's a good problem to have, but you have to somehow carve out the space where you can demonstrate doing things in a new way and that it's actually cost effective. But yeah, like I said, the short answer is no.
Other questions for Michael? All right, then let's do a couple housekeeping things and we'll get out of here for the evening. Thanks, man.
Sure. Thank you.
So you're sitting at Rackspace. For the last 3 years, Rackspace has been the place. We have been in this room every month for the last 3 years. And when we do DevOps,